Everyone, Zach here. Today I'm going to walk through building execution environments using automated pipelines in BitBucket. Specifically, I'm going to add some steps for prepping the EE for an offline use case. So you may have seen my other posts where I use GitHub to do automated execution environment builds. That's still very relevant and works well. This particular example is going to be 1, integrating with BitBucket pipelines, and 2, it's going to use Ansible to actually do the build versus doing the heavy lifting on the kind of pipeline agent side of things. So let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at what we've got here. So I'm first going to look at the BitBucket pipelines file. As you can see, it's super simple, and that comes back to we're not actually doing the Ansible builder steps in BitBucket. We're going to do it in our Ansible environment. So the first thing we do is we're going to install the requirements for this trigger script. The trigger script is simply going to process the changes for a particular commit, determine which execution environments it needs to build, and then kick off the appropriate Ansible job to start the build. So I'll dive in real quick. So the requirements.txt, super simple. I'm just using JMesPath, which is the same library used by Ansible's JSON query filter, and I do that to parse the output from BitBucket's API regarding the commit, and then request to make the post and the get to retrieve information and then start the Ansible job. So let's look at the script itself. I'm going to start from the bottom and kind of work my way up. So here at the bottom, you'll see I'm setting up a config object just based off of environment variables that are injected into the pipeline. This is a concept that's pretty similar to most of your source control solutions when they have pipelines. What you do here is first 3 are going to actually be provided by default. So any BitBucket pipeline running has these available to them if they're defined. And then I also set up an app user and app password. I'm going to use that to connect to the BitBucket API. And then I've got my AAP host and token to connect to the controller API, as well as a job template ID, so I know which job to launch. Again, it's nice to use these environment variables because specifically for the secrets, we don't have to put them in our repository. We can keep them in an external secure location and don't have to worry about leaks or anything like that. So the run function, it simply does this process changes, which is what's going to call the BitBucket API, get the diff for the commit, and determine which execution environments have changes, and then it'll just loop over them and launch Ansible jobs. So the Ansible jobs, the body's pretty simple. It's just going to give the EE name. So in my case, it's going to be the name of the folder that has a change, and then a commit hash. The commit is used for 2 things. One, it's going to be used on the Ansible side to pull the execution environment definition specific to this particular commit, and 2, it's going to be used to tag the image. So really quickly before I hop over to AAP, I want to show what repository variables look like. So again, these are what are being injected into the environment, and you'll see that there's 3 less. That's because those 3 BitBucket ones are actually by default injected into the environment. So I got my app user and password, which I've set up, and have some information in the article to do that. And then I've got my AAP host, my token, and then my job template ID that I want to run. So the job template, of course, if you're familiar with Ansible, is going to be mapped 1-to-1 to a playbook. So this is going to be the playbook for my execution environment builds. I'm using the infra.ee utilities collection, which is maintained by Red Hat's community of practice. So I always recommend using those when possible. You'll notice that I variabilize the host here for this first step. And I'm doing that because just for flexibility, really, you could hardcode if you have a specific build host in your inventory that is set up to do Ansible Builder and build your EEs, then you can hardcode it, no problem. I just have a variable here that actually defaults to my build server. The tasks, so initially what I'm going to be doing is basically pulling down the BitBucket repo and putting it into a temporary directory and loading up the execution environment file that I'm interested in, right? I'm going to use that execution environment definition sort of as like a vars file, because that's, in the end, that's what it is. It's defining how to build my execution environment. One thing to note is that you will want to upload your public key from your build server to BitBucket just to make this a simple git clone. And these 2 steps here are actually going to load up that execution environment file and decode it from YAML into a variable. So the meat of the playbook here is using this role ee_builder from that collection I mentioned. And this role is pretty powerful. It'll do all the Ansible builder steps you need, and it can actually handle multiple execution environment definitions. In our particular case, we're only going to be building one at a time. So we've got a list of one here. I can configure a base registry, so this is going to be used to pull the image that the execution environment is built off of. In my case, it'll be registry.redhat.io. I then specify a destination registry, so where do I want to push the execution environment when I'm done. And lastly here, we've got an Automation Hub host and token, which is me telling Builder to actually point at my private Automation Hub, as opposed to pulling from public Galaxy instances. And then we got an option here just to clean up the Builder directory when we're done. And you'll notice here the parameters for the EE list object look very much like an execution environment YAML definition, and that's because they are mapped one-to-one. So that's why it's easy for me to load up that execution environment file into a variable and just reference the properties that match up to the property for the execution environment list schema. And you could actually just manage your execution environments as a list in a vars file and have it that way as opposed to separate YAML files. That's totally fine. I'm using an existing directory I already had, so I was just trying to simplify not having to make a lot of changes, and loading up the definition file into a variable works for me. So once that is done, it will actually build the image, it will push it to a destination registry, and then you'll have it locally to the build server as well, of course, because that's where it built it. So what I'm then going to do, because I'm specifying the commit hash as a tag in the build step, I'm going to tag it as latest as well, and I'm going to push the latest tag, just to keep my latest tag and my commit hash in sync in my particular destination registry. The last thing I'll do is for the offline use case, so I'm going to go ahead and use Podman's containers.podman collection to save that image into a tarball. And then I'm going to run some steps to push that tarball over to an artifacts host. So in your case, this may be different, right? You may actually have like Artifactory or some other tool to host artifacts. I'm just pushing it to a host, which I variabilize here, but is an actual server in my inventory that is running a simple Nginx server. So the first thing I do is I make sure that I have a directory in my artifact server for my execution environment name, and then I sync the execution environment tarball over to the artifacts host, and I put it in a temp location, and then I publish it. So I move it from the temp location to my Nginx hosted directory, and I name it with the commit hash, and then I clean up everything. So I clean up my build directory and my temporary artifact. There's a lot of stuff there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and show what happens when we kick this off, and then I will take a look at the job template as well. So the way it would be kicked off is if a change is made, right? So a commit's made to the master branch, the pipeline will run, because I use a very simple BitBucket pipeline. So if I go to the source, and I'm going to pick the EE default execution environment, and I'm just going to edit it in line. This is normally not how you do it. You'd probably be editing it locally in your IDE and then doing a pull request, but I'm just going to go ahead and just change the file. So it's not necessarily smart enough to pick up on, I'm just changing a comment here, but no big deal. Let's commit this. So we've got my simple commit here, and if I go over to pipelines, we should see we've got a pipeline kicked off for this specific commit. And if I click into it, let's see. What we should see in the output in a few moments is that trigger Ansible script is going to print out the folders that it identifies a change in. So we should see EE default listed, and then we could be able to go over to AAP and see that there's a job running. Scroll down here. Let's click on the output. So we got our files changed, right? So EE default execution environment.yaml, and actually gives me a link over to the job that's running. But I'm just going to go over to AAP jobs, and we'll see here's our job that's running for that particular build. It is building EDE, so it'll take a few minutes, and while that's happening, I just want to go ahead and look at the job template itself. So In the job template, of course, I'm pointing to the buildy playbook that we just walked through. We got a few credentials here, so I've got to have my SSH credential that works for both the build server and the artifact server, so that I can connect and run builder on the build server, and then also copy files over to the Nginx server. And then I've got a couple of custom credentials. So I've got an Autodotes private automation hub, so that's my internal hub. And then I've got this cloud EE utilities. In my particular case, I'm pushing to a Quay registry. And that I made just to work well with the EE build playbook and inject those secret variables via a credential, so I don't have to have them in my source control. So what do those credentials look like? I actually have them on docs.autodotes.com. So if you go there and look at my list of credential types, I've got one for EE utilities. So you'll notice that the extra vars being injected are similar to what we saw in my input to the EE builder role, right? So I'm just putting in those credentials in for the base registry, and then also my destination registry, which in my example is Quay.O.Z LeBlanc. And I'm injecting those into the run so that builder can push to the relevant location. The other one used was this private automation hub. So I'm doing this to work well with the infra automation hub configuration modules, which is a similar environment variable that the builder role expects. So that AH host, AH password, AH username, you saw those lookups in the EE build playbook when I was referencing these. So I'm injecting them into the environment and then looking them up. So a couple of credentials you may want to configure. You could do it differently in your instance, however you'd like. I keep them separate because I've actually used the private automation hub for other things as well. So now I'll come back over to the job template and just show a survey real quick. So there are a few things in the survey that allow it to be a little bit configurable. So you'll notice that I defaulted the build host to Fedora in my case, and then artifacts host to Raspberry Pi. So this is my build server. I've got a Fedora instance, and then I've got a Raspberry Pi running reverse proxy where I'm pushing the artifacts. So a couple other things, I did default the artifacts destination directory, and I'll show in a moment on the artifacts website what that looks like. And then we've got the EE name, which is required. So I'm passing that in. If we remember in that trigger Ansible script, I use the name of the folder and I set it to the EE name. And same with the version, I set it to the commit hash. So all in all, that's kind of what's being passed over from BitBucket to Ansible, and then the job runs and will do the build for us and publish it. When you click on the build, I'll show you the details just to kind of map what I was talking about. So you see here that we passed over EE default, we passed over the commit hash, and then the default values for these others were used. I could have overwritten them if I wanted to. So while that's running, I'll go ahead and show the structure of the artifacts website. So you can see here, I'm in that destination directory I made, Ansible execution environments. I've got a couple folders, so I set it up this way. So if I have multiple EEs, they each have a folder, and then within that folder would be the different versions that I've published so far. So for EE default, I've actually built one. The process happening right now will be adding another tarball to this directory. And where that's useful, and kind of how the article concludes, is once you have a tarball for the offline use case, it's just a matter of pulling it down from your artifacts destination, either from your offline, if you have connection to an artifactory or a repository, you could pull it down and use podman load and then push it to your automation hub that way. You could also pull it down on the connected environment and rsync it over to the disconnected. Whatever mechanism you have set up to get to your disconnected, this tarball is a great way to do it. And then once it's in the disconnected, it's a simple podman load and podman push, and then you can have it available in your AAP environment that's disconnected. So let's come back to Ansible, and I will show you the output once it's done running. All right, everyone, and I'm back. We are finished here. We've synced our tarball to the artifact server, published it, and then cleaned up after it. So let's hop over to the artifact server and see what we've got. Go ahead and refresh this folder. You can see we now have an updated list of tarballs here in our EE default. If I come back over to BitBucket and go to commits, you should see my last commit, 3DB. Let's go back over here, and there it is, right? So that's our second commit tagged. Nice thing here is like whatever version you're using, you can always use that commit hash, go back to BitBucket and figure out exactly what was within that execution environment. There's also a great CLI tool, Ansible Navigator, to do that, but we won't get into it. The last steps I did want to show just on Red Hat's documentation for disconnected boundaries, how you can now leverage this tarball, right? So Podman has some nice commands for this. So you can do a Podman image and you can load from that particular tarball. You can tag what you've just loaded, so that would be your local host and then the custom EE. In my case, it would have been EE default, and then I can give it my hub fully qualified domain name with the same name and latest, and then I can log into my hub and push it, right? And then you'll have that execution environment in your private automation hub instance, which you can then use to connect a controller and start using it. And of course, like these are Podman commands, so you can always automate this step as well. No need to kind of go in and do this manually, but I just wanted to show these commands as well. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions on how to kind of complete the process or tweak it to fit your needs, please feel free to drop a question in the comments. Thank you.